First off, I'd just like to thank everybody for watching the attachment video. I honestly didn't think that people would watch it. I know there's a lot of questions about it, and I'm thinking about doing a follow-up to it to address these questions and comments. I know I really didn't go over the specifics of each attachment and what they actually do, but maybe I'll go over those. So if you want to ask them in this video as well, and hopefully I can clear up some of the things that you guys are asking. But anyway, let's get into spread. So what is spread and why is it a good thing? There are two different things that affect where the bullet goes in Battlefield games. There is spread and there is recoil. Recoil is simply how much the gun kicks left, right, and up. For each bullet fired, there is kick or recoil. Along with this, there is spread. Spread is when the bullets deviate from where the crosshair is pointed. This means that the bullet does not go exactly where you aim the gun. This spread is measured in degrees from center, usually from around 0.2 degrees on the low end to 2 degrees on the higher end. Of course, this is dependent on the game. As we all know, the spread when we first shoot a gun is low, and then after we continue to shoot for a while, the spread gets worse, and we get a lot of inaccuracy. How spread is calculated is different from game to game and is dependent on a lot of things, but generally speaking, the more you shoot, the more spread you have. In this video, I won't really be going over like each game and the mechanics for those games. Maybe I will in the future, but probably not. Now, most people will think that this is a bad thing, mostly because high skill players do not want randomness in their game, not knowing that randomness is really not that random and is easily predictable, and lower rated players simply just don't know. You may ask yourself, how is randomness predictable? Well, if I gave you a coin, could you tell me the chance that it lands heads? Or how about a dice? Even in complex games like poker, where the cards that are dealt are completely random, players can manipulate the outcome of the game extremely reliably. Good card players can easily influence games, even in games like Hearts where there is no betting. We see that good players in these games stay at the top level, and this is not by some fluke. Just because it's random doesn't mean it's unpredictable or that the outcome cannot be influenced. That influence takes knowledge and skill to manipulate properly to your advantage. So how can we predict where bullets will go and what the chances are of that bullet landing? Well, like I said, there is a value for spread in degrees. We can then find the maximum deviation from the point of aim by doing some math. I love math. And then rotating that in a circle and getting a cone of fire. From there, we can then place the soldier inside and we can see how much of the area overlaps and we can get a percentage. This is our coin flip. In most cases, in Battlefield, spread really is not an issue. When you're fighting at 12 meters, spread really never plays a role. It's once we start getting out to 30 or 40 meters, we can really tell that spread is affecting the guns, and we need to adjust and use proper shooting mechanics. So what are some of the ways we can influence something that is random in Battlefield? Well, we can learn more about the mechanics of the game, and we can use them to maximize the effectiveness of our guns. For example, knowing how effective your gun is at range and how far away your target is, and then using that info to properly burst your gun takes a lot of game knowledge and skill to pull off. Without that, you're significantly hampered and your effectiveness decreases. This allows the player who is better, more skilled, and knows the game better to beat and outplay other less skilled players. Adding a mechanic that adds to the user having to know more about the game and its mechanics is not subtractive, but additive to the game and overall skill ceiling. Spread effectively lowers the skill floor, meaning that bad players will be even worse because they don't know what they are doing. How many times have you seen on that cesspool of a website called Reddit that new players can't figure out how to hit anything? They are simply not using the proper shooting technique to get what they want. So how about on higher end of the spectrum? Well, if you shoot longer, then you will have worse accuracy. And if you're not dead on target, you might miss due to spread. This means that in order to be at the maximum potential to kill people, you need to hit your first few shots and you need to aim center mass. Because if you don't, your spread will be worse than the other players, and you might miss because you're not on center mass or on target. These slight details might mean a lot in a competitive setting, and but Counter-Strike doesn't have any spread, and that's a competitive game. Yes, it does. Guns are not 100% accurate, even when not moving or anything. In fact, the spread in CS:GO is worse than in BF4. Also, as a side note, BF5 has has almost the exact same gun mechanics as CS:GO, both having spread, both having recoil patterns, and both having randomness built into the recoil pattern. Yes, Battlefield 5 has recoil patterns, and they are just very loose, and we don't know what they are, and we never will. There is a lot more there's a lot more depth around that, but it's not really that important. One of the other things about spread is that if we know how to maximize the gun's range, we can then effectively beat weaker players with guns that are not meant for that range. This is the case where game knowledge can be used to increase the effectiveness of a gun and beat weaker players that otherwise have an advantage since they're using a gun designed for that range. The corollary to this argument, however, is, well, why don't we just get rid of spread so good players will always win? Well, then what is balance? You would have to limit guns to a range by reducing the damage to a point where you're shooting peas at people, which doesn't feel good. Look at what they did to the BF5 SMGs and Battlefront 2 guns. Battlefront 2 is a perfect example of what happens when you have no spread, by the way. Not exactly good gunplay, and it's just not interesting. So, what is the inherent problem with spread? Well, it's only as good as the designers make it, and that's the game that it's in. This unfortunately leads to some negative aspects that are unintended by the designers. You see, humans are lazy and not very good at non-linear tasks. In my attachment video, I advocate for guns and attachments that are the most consistent and require little thought to use, and thus 99% as good as the high demanding and focused comp stubby of the AEK. Let's look at BF3 and in part BF4. You see, microbursting is the best way to use a gun in those games. Up close, it doesn't matter. But in BF3, with how the game worked, there was no reason whatsoever to run anything other than the M16 since spread reset in exactly one frame. The other issue was the 10 Hz logic loop, which pretty much meant every gun spits out the same rounds at the exact same time, initially meaning that you could trade with even the FAMAS and the AN-94. Let's look at the game that was supposed to have a high skill ceiling gunplay mechanic. The spread model in BF1 is incredibly complex and nuanced. It required a lot of game knowledge and skill to really use the weapons to their fullest extent. However, what ended up happening was that most players just, instead of learning the mechanic, held mouse 1 and used the guns that were good up close and only stayed in that range. Even though it was the devs' best attempt to make a skill-based spread system, people just found that it was easier to just get closer to the other player and mouse 1 them instead of learning a complex system, even though they could win gunfights at further distance than other players who did not do this. This type of play is only exacerbated in the comp scene, where in reality people just put more bullets down range and hope they hit instead of thinking hard about what to do and optimally burst a gun because you're in a high stress environment. So really, these mechanics only apply to high level pub stompers. And if you know anything about pub stompers, you know that most of them are babies and complain about everything, especially when it requires them to do something other than brainlessly push people and click on them. This is the main reason why so many good players did not make the transition from BF4 to BF1. The game required something for them to learn, and they didn't like that. In reality, these spread mechanics pretty much ended up being ingrained after a while, and you don't even notice them anymore, which for me is a reason why we shouldn't have super complex spread mechanics in the first place, because after a while, they really aren't hard for good players, and they get used to them quickly without thinking about them. The other issue is that spread mostly hurts bad players and not good players for the aforementioned reason. Bad players cannot learn these mechanics and shoot guns, and shooting the gun simply feels bad and unlearnable. You have to realize most players will never go to YouTube and even look up the game, never mind figure out how to properly shoot guns. And I feel like this is a failure on the devs' part. They simply do not do enough to educate their player base. It requires the third parties to give out info, and most of the time, especially with YouTube, the info is wrong. A well-educated player base is incredibly important for the life of your game and keeping your players around. So hopefully you can take something away from this video that is positive and maybe learned a thing or two, maybe have a different outlook on how the mechanic works and why it's in the game. I think a lot of people don't realize just how difficult it is to make a video game, and the people who are making them are experts, and they probably know a lot more than you or me.